Okay, everyone. So the reading this week, you're going to read about the New Testament and the Gospels. Last time, or the last few weeks, you've been reading about the Old Testament. The New Testament is all about Jesus Christ and his life, death, and resurrection. And we learn about this through the Gospels, so you're going to read a lot about the Gospels. There's 4 Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And it's kind of a mistake to read these Gospels as though they're history. They're really trying to make a case for Jesus as the Messiah, and so it's really more like an argument. Although they do use historical evidence, their historical evidence isn't always 100% accurate. Sometimes the different Gospels aren't consistent about the order of events, or they're not consistent about geographical kind of locations of things. But that wasn't really their goal. It wasn't trying to be super accurate about those things, but rather prove that Jesus is the Messiah with examples from things that Jesus said and did in his life. Again, there are 4 Gospels, and there are, some of the first chapter you will read, will be about how the Gospels came to be written and what the process was and what they were trying to say. And so the gospel would have been kind of put together in 5 stages. The book talks about 3 of them. I'm just adding in a couple more. But the first stage is the life stage. That would be when the events actually took place. When Jesus actually said those words, when he performed that miracle, when he gave that teaching, told that parable. And then the second stage is the oral stage. So these stories were passed on orally, which is true for the whole Bible. Some of the Old Testament books were passed on orally for about 500 years. When we're talking about the New Testament, these stories were passed on for 35, 60 years, but not as long as the Old Testament. And then they were finally written down. The person who would sit down and write it today, we would call the author. And so our idea of author is a little bit different than biblical times. A lot of times the people who they call the author are the people who they heard the story from, or who originated the story. Like Matthew, for example, the apostle would have had people who were his followers after Jesus, and so some anonymous person writes down what Matthew told them, and they say this is the gospel or the good news according to Matthew. Okay, so keep in mind that authorship doesn't necessarily mean the person who wrote it down, but rather the evangelist or the person who told about the events in Jesus' life. Then there's the editing and publishing. In editing, they would do some translating, and publishing, they would decide, what kind of Bible do we want? Do we want this to be easy to read, close to the text? Do we want it to sound poetic? That kind of thing, okay? So in the life stage, this is when Jesus actually did the events. The written stage happened, like I said, 35, 50, 60 years later. And again, the people who wrote it would have been the gospel evangelists. We have Matthew, Mark, and Luke, who are known as the synoptic gospels. The word synoptic means when seen together, they're similar. And there are books that are called synopsis that will line the gospels up side by side with the same story, and you can see all 4, or mostly 3, versions of the same story. Matthew, Mark, and Luke were written before John. John's gospel is 90% unique. What we believe, honestly, is that Mark's gospel was written first. It's kind of the shortest, most to the point. That Matthew and Luke's were written kind of simultaneously while the 2 people didn't realize that the other was writing. And that these used Mark as a resource, but also had to have some resource that they both shared that they would have looked off, because they have a lot of stories in common, but they didn't know about each other. They were kind of writing at the same time. And so that source we call the Q source, which is from the German word Quell, which means source. And a German theologian came up with this theory. So Matthew and Luke would have used Mark, they would have used the Q source, and then they would have each had their own kind of pocket of information that were unique to their gospels as well. So what I'm saying is you can find some stories that are only in Matthew or only in Luke. The prodigal son, for example, is only in Luke. But you also will find most of what's in Mark's gospel in Matthew and Luke. And then again, John's gospel we think was written last and is 90% unique, which makes sense because he would have had copies at that point of all three of the synoptic gospels. And if you were going to sit down and write a fourth account of the same thing, you would want to make sure you have something new to add to that story. So he's kind of filling in the blanks. It's not like John doesn't think those other things happened, but rather here's some other evidence that proves again that Jesus is the Messiah. And again, the authors, when I'm talking about Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they're really more the gospel evangelists, and probably an anonymous person wrote them down. If any of the four of them actually physically wrote it down, it could have possibly been John. According to legend, he did live to be quite old. And some people think that the John that's referenced isn't the Apostle John. That's kind of a point of contention. In their Gospels, a couple of things your book will talk about is their Christologies. Basically, when they talk about Christology, they're talking about the human and divine nature of Jesus. When they talk about a low Christology, they're thinking more of the human. So if you think of this in terms of low being earth and high being the heavens, a low Christology would be more focused on the human Jesus. A high Christology would be more focused on the divine Jesus. Another topic that you'll read about is the Messianic secret. This would have been any time that Jesus told someone, don't tell anyone what I just said or did. And there's some theories in the reading about why that might have been Jesus' intent to keep it a secret, at least a secret for a while. There is important information that's given to us through the passion narratives. These would be the stories of the death and resurrection of Jesus. And each gospel has a different passion narrative with some things in common and some things unique. Another thing that your book will talk about is the importance of baptism and Eucharist. These are two foundational sacraments that I believe all Christians agree with as sacraments. In the Catholic Church, we have a few other sacraments, but baptism and Eucharist find their roots in the Bible story, especially in the story with Jesus. Another chapter will talk all about Paul and the contributions of St. Paul as an apostle. It's kind of unique to consider Paul an apostle because he didn't actually know the human Jesus. He only knew the divine Jesus. He had an encounter with the resurrected Jesus after the death of Jesus. He actually was anti-Christian until that point in time, and then converts and does so much for Christianity by traveling all over, setting up churches, and then writing to those churches in letters that we have in the New Testament. So some of the main themes in these letters deal with how is a person saved, and according to Paul, that's by faith and not by our works. As Catholics, we don't agree with St. Paul. We think it's a combination of your faith and good works. Paul is reacting to some people going through the motions of empty works that he saw as a Pharisee Jew, and he thinks that it comes down to our faith alone. Also, he talks about discipleship and how we live as Christians. You'll read about some of the churches of the time, like some of the bigger places where they had a real heavy concentrated group of Christians and what those churches kind of had to offer. One chapter will kind of go through the history that you're going to then read and talk about the different eras in church history. And then the last chapter kind of focuses on how did Christianity stop being a specific type of Jewish sect and become its own religion. The break between Judaism and Christianity happened or started around 49 AD and was complete by the time St. John wrote the gospel, or someone wrote the gospel in St. John's name. And so after Christianity became its own religion, there were some mystery religions and some heresies. A heresy is what we call a false teaching or a lie against the church. And there were many different little pockets of groups that called themselves Christian, but taught things that the Christian church didn't agree with, and were later declared heresies and kind of banished from the church. And as you read about these heretical groups, I think one thing that's important to point out is that they asked some good questions and they brought up some good points that forced the church to actually sit down and articulate what it actually believed about the nature of Jesus and Jesus's teachings. And so the heresies were unfortunate, but at the same time, they really did challenge an early church and cause that church to put into words what it actually believed and just really hone in on a real doctrine for that church, which in the end I think was a good thing. So before I let you go, I do want to remind you that this week you're doing another reading task, and that next week you take a second quiz that will follow the same format of the first quiz. And then be thinking about that research paper and what topic you want to write it about, because again, there is an outline due on October 6th. If you have any questions about the research paper or anything else, please email me. Again, the best email is vancatj@mercyhigh.org, which is on the syllabus. Have a great week.